Right, hello. Hello and welcome to our webinar on the NCVO Almanac 2017. My name is Michael Burbissel. I am the Public Services Policy Manager at NCVO, and I am joined by...
Hi, I'm Jack Egan, and I work in the research team at NCVO.
Jack is first going to take you through some of the key findings in this year's Almanac. I will then talk about some of the policy implications, particularly for NCVO's work, that we get from the Almanac's conclusions, and then lastly there will be a section for your questions about what you've heard today. So those are the rough timings. Off you go, Jack.
Cool, thanks Michael. Yes, so the rough structure of the session today is going to be taking you through first the income and spending in the sector, and then having a brief look at the net worth of the sector, moving on to how the sector contributes to the economy and society in the UK, and then I'll pass back to Michael, who's going to discuss the policy implications of the findings that we've seen in this year's Almanac. So first things first, I thought it would be good to just give you a quick overview of what the Almanac actually is. So it's an annual publication that we create here at NCVO that looks into civil society in the UK and the voluntary sector more broadly. And we have three kind of main areas of focus. So first of all, we look into the finances of the sector, and how we do that is we take data that's submitted by charities to the Charity Commission, so their accounts data, and analyse that. We also look into volunteering, and we do that by using the Community Life Survey, which is run out of DCMS now. And finally, we look into the workforce of the sector, which is done by using the Labour Force Survey, which is again run by the ONS, I believe. And there's two main products that we create with the Almanac programme. So first of all, the website, which the link is on screen there. I'm sure a few of you have had a look on that website over the years, and it's a great resource. It's got a really wide range of data on there. And this year we've created a couple of animations as well, which go over the kind of top line findings of the study this year, and they're really useful to just get a brief overview of the data. And we also have a paper publication as well, which I've got a copy of here, which is free for our members. And again, it visualizes the data quite nicely, and it's just a nice resource to have there in the office to flick through. So we aim to publish around April, May time, and we're already working on next year's edition. And we are keen to hear from you guys as well, so any inquiries you have about the data, or maybe specific queries about a particular area, do get in contact with us. The email address on the screen there is the one to use, research@ncvo.org.uk, and we'll endeavour to get back to you, obviously workflow permitting and project timings according. So let's move on to some of the data. So we know that the voluntary sector in the UK is amazingly diverse. We have around 166,000 organisations spread across the whole breadth of the country, looking into many different areas. So some of the most common beneficiaries are children and young people. So we've got nearly 100,000 organisations looking specifically at youth issues, then organisations that look at elderly people's issues, and then people with disabilities as well. And something else that's very important, and that we know from looking at the data time and time again, is that the majority of charities are operating locally, particularly those smaller organisations. Perhaps it's a good point here to just go through the income bandings that we use in the Almanac data. So if you look at the categories on the left-hand side of the slide there, so micro-organisations mean organisations with an income of less than £10,000 per year. Small is 10,000 to 100,000, medium is 100,000 to 1 million, large is 1 million to 10 million, major is 10 million to 100 million, and then super major is organisations with an income of over £1 million per year. And what this chart's telling us is that basically the smaller that you are, the more likely you are to be working at a local level. So those purple blocks there are showing the percentages of those organisations working at local level. And then if you look down towards the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side of the chart, you can see that it's the larger organisations that are more likely to be working at a national level or overseas in those blue bars there. So moving on to, let's have a look at a bit more in-depth look at the income and spending in the sector. So we're going to give you a little tester here. It's the first poll of the day. So we'd like you to try and have a guess at what percentage of organisations have an income of below 100,000. So your answer options there are 51%, 63%, 82%, or 88%. So just give you a few moments to mull that over. It's quite a tough one to start off with. Yes. So let's see. So the correct answer is 82%, and well, yeah, 39% of you got that right, and that was the largest amount. So well done. That's not too bad. Good start. So that 82% figure is actually quite a significant one. So we can see that organisations with an income of less than 100k per year actually make up 82% of the total number of organisations, but they actually only account for 5% of the income of the sector. Whereas if you flip it around and look at organisations with £1 million or more income, they make up only 3% of the number of organisations, but actually account for 80% of the income. So it just shows the big disparities that we're working with in the sector. It's something that we're seeing kind of year on year, but it's definitely a strong trend there. So looking at income and expenditure over time, we've seen that particularly over the last few years there's been some quite healthy growth in terms of both expenditure and income. So income's up to 45.5 billion now, with expenditure of 43.3 billion. And it's important to note that it's not all charities that are seeing this. Again, it's those really large charities that have been kind of benefiting the most from this increases in income. So you can see the dotted line area on the chart there just shows that it's the super major organisations that have seen the biggest increases in income. Whereas if you look at the grey line at the bottom there, for example, the micro smallest is very flat. Same with medium organisations. So it does go to show that there is this kind of split between the very largest and then the very smallest in the sector. And it's something that we've seen continuing to grow over the years. So in our latest data, we've seen that there's 42 organisations with an income of over £1 million. And if you compare that back to 2008, there was only 26. It's around a 60% increase. So it's a big increase over the years, and it's something that we're going to keep an eye on going forward to see if levels continue to increase. Now, one of the good things about our data set is it allows us to really investigate the sources of income. And this chart here just shows the various different sources and how much they make up. So we can see that individuals actually contribute the largest portion of voluntary sector income. So around 20 to 21 billion pounds comes from individuals. That's followed by government income, which is around 15 billion. And then income from the voluntary sector itself is 4 billion. And when we look at those three main proportions over time, we can see that it is the income from individuals that's been growing most steadily over the past kind of 3-4 years, and it's up to 20.6 billion, as I said. And because of these increases, it's quite interesting to just dive a bit deeper into that income from individuals, and our data set allows us to do that. So when we split that down into the different forms of income from individuals, this slide tells us a couple of interesting things. So first of all, we can see that it's donations from individuals that are making up the largest proportion of income from individuals, around 7.6 billion there. But secondly, when we group the different types into voluntary income and earned income, we can see that it's earned income. So that's income from activities for generating funds or charitable activities. So that's your fees for services provided or rent on accommodation. That's actually making up the bigger proportion of income from individuals. So again, we can look at this data over time, which gives us some quite interesting insights actually. And we can see that it is that earned income we've been seeing quite healthy and steady growth over the past 4 to 5 years. When you compare that to the donations and the legacies, they've been a little bit more stable. And it just goes to show that charities are doing more and more to diversify their income streams, build their own income, and it's something that we're going to be seeing, and as NCVO we're going to be focusing on more in the future as well, and just giving the support that charities need as other income sources become a little bit more difficult to find and competition is increasing for those. Next question. So this one refers to government income. So since 2000, in which year does government income peak? And the answer options for that are 2003, 2004, 2009, 2010, 2012, 2013, and 2014, 2015. And this is an area that Michael's going to be looking into in a bit more detail in the policy section as well. So I'll just give you a few more minutes to think about that one. Okay, so the correct answer is 2009, 2010. And again, the majority of you got that right. 41% got that correct. So well done to you. Give yourself a pat on the back for that. So let's look at that data in a little bit more detail then. So as we can see, we're up, that peak of was 15.7 billion back in 2009-10. And our latest data point says that income from government is up to 15.3 billion. So making a bit of progress towards that peak in the past few years. But I would add in a note of caution here that although we are seeing increases, there's certain things about those increases that we need to be cautious about, and again, Michael will touch on this later in the session. And the second thing this slide tells us is the gap between government contract income and government income in the form of grants. And we can see there's been a real widening in the gap. If we look back at 2001 and 2000, for example, the split's around 50-50 between grants and contract income. Whereas if you fast forward to today, you see that split is about 80-20. So £12.4 billion from government is coming in the form of contracts, and only 2.9 is coming in the form of grants. And those grants are becoming very competitive to access, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And it's something that we'll be continuing to look at going forward in years to come. So where does that government grant and contract income actually go? So somewhat unsurprisingly, the majority of contract income is going towards social service provision and organisations that work in that field. And then if you compare that to the grant income, you can see that it's actually culture and recreation organisations that are getting the most grant income, but obviously when you compare the amounts involved, it's a big difference. And this brings us on to probably one of the most interesting things that we found in this year's data actually, and it's involving the split between government income from central government and local government. So this is the first year since we've been running the Almanac that central government income has actually overtaken local government income. So central government income is now on 7.3 billion, and it's overtaking the local government income, which is on 7.1 billion. And again, it may not seem that interesting, but as Michael will go into in a little bit more detail later on, there's some really interesting consequences from this, and it's something that we'll be monitoring going forward and just seeing if it's a sustained trend or whether it's something that's just happened in this year's data. But regardless, it's something that's new to the data for this year, which also excites researchers. So again, just bringing things back to the income levels of charities, we can see that it is the larger organisations that are most likely to benefit from government funding. we can see that only 16% of the smallest organisations are 16% of their income is coming from government. When you compare that to major organisations, it's 42. It's a big difference there. Again, it's a theme that runs through the presentation that small versus big is a serious issue in this sector. And just to touch upon spending, so charities are spending the bulk of their money on delivering their mission, as you'd expect. So around 70% of the spending that charities make is towards their mission via charitable activities. So that's about £30 billion. And then we've got some smaller things. So grant making is around 6.4 billion, and then the cost, so generating funds is around 6 billion also. And just moving on to the net worth of the sector. So we can see that in terms of assets, after some fluctuation around the recession and the 2008 crash, we've seen that there has been some growth over the past few years, which has brought the level of assets up to being worth around £112 billion. But again, we need to mention that it's not all charities that are kind of seeing these assets grow in value. If we look at some of the data, we can see that only 15% of the smallest charities have any tangible fixed assets whatsoever. When you compare that to the largest charities, you can see that almost 100% of them have fixed assets. And probably more surprising is that 44% of the smallest charities have no reserves whatsoever. It just underlines the really testing environment that those small organisations are working in, and again the need for support and from government and organisations such as ourselves. So moving on to the kind of final third of my data part presentation, and it's just going to be looking at the contribution that the sector makes to the UK economy and wider society. And we're going to kick off with another poll for you. So this one's regarding volunteering. So how many people in the UK volunteered formally at least once a month in 2015-16? So by formally we mean volunteering through an organisation, a group or a club, things like that. And your answer options are 14.2 million, 15.7 million, 17 million or 17.9 million. And just a reminder, if you've had any questions, feel free to just drop them in the question panel on your visual there, and they'll come up for us at the end and we can address them for you. So the correct answer for this one is 14.2 million. And actually, so this is the first one the majority of people have got wrong. So things are going downhill. Yes, so most people put this 15.7 million, so optimistic, but not quite. So looking at the data, the story with volunteering data is one of stability. So we can see that both volunteering regularly, so in the past month, or less regularly in the past year, levels have remained very consistent right back to 2001. We've seen very little fluctuation. It's worth noting at this point that it is the younger age group that we see the largest proportion of that are volunteering regularly. So 16 to 25 is around a third of those are volunteering formally at least once a month, which is a positive sign. So where is it that people are volunteering, and what are the activities that that people are looking to volunteer around? Sport is kind of dominating things here, so around 50% of people that volunteered in the past 12 months did that volunteering around sport and exercise. And then the second kind of highest is around arts and social clubs, different forms of recreation. But we do see a really wide spread of different types here. And it's quite interesting to think about what are the things that prevent people from volunteering or make them stop volunteering if they have been previously. And we can see from this chart here that 2 out of the 5 top reasons for stopping volunteering are actually around time. And I think it just goes to show that we need to remember that people live in increasingly time-pressured lives. not only due to work, but also things like Netflix and the availability of box set upon box set. So I think we need to make sure that volunteering is flexible and people can fit it in when they can, and also do it with the people they want to. I mean, there's evidence that if you're able to volunteer with your friends, you're much more likely to say yes and take part in that volunteering activity. So it's things like that, bearing that kind of thing in mind, that will help us keep that stability and inevitably help grow levels of volunteering going forward. And just a quick look at some of the workforce data that we have in the Almanac. So we can see that there's been a nice amount of growth since last year. So 3% the workforce has gone up to, so around 850,000 employees in the voluntary sector now. And just to break that down, it's a predominantly female workforce, so around 2/3 of the workforce are female. And the workforce are much more likely to work in smaller organisations. So that purple bar at the bottom there highlighted just shows that around 50% of people working in the sector are working in an organisation that has under 25 employees. So just to wrap things up from my point of view, the sector makes a massive contribution to the UK economy. ONS estimates that it contributes around 12 billion to the economy, which is roughly around the size of the Cypriot economy, if you need a comparison there. And also just the range of organisations, the big workforce, and the millions of volunteers just help build a more social economy as well. I'm just going to pass you over now to Michael, who's going to discuss some of the policy implications of what we found.
Hi everyone. Before I start, I'm going to remind you all we've had a few great questions in, but do keep jotting them down into your questions panel as they occur to you, and we'll be getting to them very shortly. So, as Jack says, I'm going to talk you through some of the implications for voluntary sector policy, and particularly our work here at NCVO. So, in many ways, the data shows a continuation of previous trends. And some of the implications from that are self-evident. So donations remain a really important source of income from the sector, and one of the many reasons, and it is one of the many reasons that we need to protect public trust in charities. Similarly, understanding the scale of Europe's contribution to the sector in terms of income, in terms of workforce, also helps us prioritise our policy work. But read in the wider context of the economy and political environment and our expectations of how that will change, one of the most interesting questions that emerges is where and how do we expect, or can we see, the voluntary organisations growing? So having seen those recent increases in government income that Jack showed us, and which are represented there in the light blue line, you might be tempted to think that that's where we can expect some growth, but these figures do need to be read in context. Government spending is cyclical, and we know that austerity is set to continue, and cuts do tend to be focused towards the start of spending cycles. This year's Almanac data takes us to the end of the 2010-2015 spending cycle, and so we think that actually looking at increases in recent years don't necessarily mean that there's a longer-term reversal of that preceding downward trend. We need to be cautious about expecting further increases. Those dotted lines on this graph here are linear trends. They aren't forecasts, but they do give a sense that both in terms of central government spending and government income to the sector are still on overall downward trends, despite recent rises in government income to the sector. And we can also tell something about that distribution of that recent growth. Recent rises in government income have continued to be concentrated in major and super major charities. So those are charities with an income of over £10 million. So it looks like small and medium-sized charities haven't been as able in recent years to participate in public service delivery, and indeed micro, small and medium organisations have seen net decreases in government income. And that trend's even clearer when we look at local government income alone. So we know that there's increasing pressure on public services, and that reinforces the importance of our long-running work to help break down the barriers that charities are facing when trying to deliver public services. But the picture is wider than this. The policy-making levers that we are able to pull at a central level are diminishing. So, for example, looking forward, the government now has a set of reasonably good quality grant-making guidelines, which should in theory lead to greater confidence in using grants as a proportionate, transparent procurement method. But we won't necessarily see this replicated automatically at a local level. So our influencing strategy needs to be locally, not centrally focused, and looking towards opportunities around further devolution, around that the city mayors might provide, and working with those making commissioning decisions. So that's something, for example, that we do through our membership of the Health and Wellbeing Alliance and through our delivery of part of the Commissioning Academy. And we also have to think about whether there are ways that we can enable a step change in our ability to deploy informal resources. So how can we shift those stable but unmoving levels of volunteering that Jack showed us, and do we need a more nuanced approach to the role of volunteering in public service delivery? And going back to my original question, where do we see growth? Well, we think we have to look towards individuals for growth, specifically towards earned income. There has been very little net growth in donations since 2007-8, 6% compared to the 35% growth in earned income, driven primarily by fees for services, which are income earned by charities from doing charitable activities. And the relative lack of growth in donations is perhaps not surprising. If you look at that light purple line, those are IFS, Institute of Fiscal Studies, and Office of Budget Responsibility figures for median household income, and households have not seen their incomes rise a great deal in recent years, and on their projections isn't going to rise. So and the OBR, as I said, is expecting that growth to soar because of higher inflation. So if that correlation continues, we have to start thinking about how much we can expect donations to grow on the basis of the wider economic picture, and consequently about where it is productive for us as a sector to put the resources that we do have into generating income. And we think the answer to that will increasingly be earned income. Zooming out a bit to the wider picture, we think that the Dormant Assets Commission in particular presents us with a rare opportunity to invest in our local communities and set up local voluntary organisations for long-term sustainability through asset-based approaches. So endowing community foundations and building on community asset ownership schemes, enabling charities to generate their own income for years to come. For those of you who have had a chance to read NCVO's pre-election manifesto, and if you haven't, it's a really good read, I recommend it. You'll see that these conclusions I've just talked about around the role of volunteering and the need to strengthen our local communities lie at the heart of our policy, and as ever they are driven by and drawn from the vital work that is the Almanac. So that's everything from me. Here are some useful links for you. You can probe through the data yourself at data.ncvo.org.uk, and you can have a look at our manifesto as well. We're now going to take some of your questions that you've been busily typing to us, and please feel free to continue doing so. So, Jack, Paul's question is, why are major and super major charities seeing such big increases in income?
Yeah, interesting question. I think it's probably a combination of factors. So in terms of the income from government, we know that they're getting a larger proportion of that than smaller charities. And it's also a kind of question of economies of scale almost. When you're such a big organisation, you've got the resources to be able to go for different funding streams, to go for bids that maybe smaller organisations wouldn't be able to go for at all, or would be struggling to find resources for. They have to pick and choose more, whereas the larger organisations can really go for a wider mix.
And if I can talk to that point from a sort of from the other side of the coin, I think part of the answer to this are commissioning trends. So how are commissioners, so there's an increasingly number of particularly local commissioners. We've got local authorities, we've got CCGs, we've got police and crime commissioners. they in many areas are increasingly aggregating contract sizes, and that does make it very difficult for smaller providers to consequently bid for those contracts. And that's something that's been a running theme through my team, the public services team here at NCVO's work, in terms of trying to break down some of those commissioning barriers and trying to produce more helpful behaviours that enable a diverse public services marketplace.
Yeah, so another question here from Andy around localized data and the Almanac. Now, this is something that we would 100% love to be able to provide, but we're relying on data from the Charity Commission, and the thing is, when it gets down to the smallest organisations, we are limited. So organisations with an income of under 10,000 don't have to submit any accounts to Charity Commission. So automatically we're starting to struggle in terms of pinning down those very locally operating organisations. And in terms of the infrastructure around providing data that's split down to that local level, it is very time-intensive process in terms of setting up the data code. But it's something that we are looking into, and we are constantly kind of looking at the Almanac and how it's run, and we have an advisory group that advises us on where we should be taking the Almanac. And this localization issue is definitely one of the top ones that we're looking at. But I can't promise anything at the moment, Andy, but it's something that's on our radar.
And am I right in thinking there's also a bit of a challenge around the way that organisations register? So if given that we are pulling this data from charity accounts, it might be that actually you're only going to report your head office rather than necessarily your sort of area of benefit, or where your offices are actually, your local offices are actually located. So it can be quite difficult to actually pick up sometimes the local branches of charities that form part of larger organisations. Let's have a look. So there's a question from Marie here around the state of the sector in terms of reserves, and sort of a reduction in the reserves of medium-sized organisations. That is something that we're alive to. I mean, you can go and have a look at the data on this yourself under the assets section of the NCVO website. I could try and pull it up now, but I'd ruin the slideshow. But that is something that we are keeping an eye on. We are aware that medium-sized organisations are often in the position where they are face challenges in terms of generating income, often because they don't have the staff and and they've seen the sort of biggest reductions in grants often over the last few years, but they are not small enough to essentially just be run by volunteers. So that they're they are really at that point of the greatest financial pressure in a lot of instances, and that can indeed have an effect on their reserve levels. I'd put a sort of word of caution on reading too much into 1 year's worth of data. This is a sort of series data set, and often that you see lines dip up or down in 1 year, and actually the overall trend is quite different. So I wouldn't panic too much over the most recent years of data if that shows a small dip, say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So we've got a question from Martin, a very, very difficult question that I don't think either myself or Michael are going to be able to answer for you here today, but
I can talk about what we're doing around
here. Yeah, Martin asks, what do we think the impact Brexit will have on the sector? Who knows? Let's see. So in terms of the Almanac data, one of the areas we've looked into a little bit, and it's something we're going to be looking into more in the coming months, is some of the workforce data regarding the proportion of EU workers that are in the voluntary sector. Our latest figure for that was around 4% of the total voluntary sector workforce comes from the EU. But this is an area we're definitely going to be focused on more. I think we have a blog post lined up sometime this summer that's going to be giving some more kind of focused conclusions after looking at that data. But we also do have a Brexit kind of focus in the policy team that Michael will probably.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, our sort of, we are doing a lot of work around Brexit and the impact it will have. We, in fact, took on a member of staff to deal specifically with this issue, and broadly, we think it's going to have impact across 3 areas. The first is funding, the second is workforce, as Jack's talked about, and the third is regulation, and we're looking at all those in quite some detail. In terms of funding, we are doing our best to identify precisely how much European funding reaches the sector. It can be quite challenging in terms of the Almanac, because essentially the European funding has so many sorts of levels and so many actors in it that by the time it reaches the charity, that charity might not even particularly in their accounts identify it as specifically European funding. So it's not always possible to sort of, our estimates in the Almanac, there are estimates around European funding, but they are probably an underestimate. Yeah. The other way we're trying to do this is by looking at what the government has said that European structural funds in particular have been spent on. So that's the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund, and we are doing some work to sort of track down how that's been distributed and how much of that's gone to the voluntary sector. But the challenge there is that often it is distributed to effectively prime contractors who then subcontract and often deliver that through charities. But there is a level of visibility that isn't available in the data where, you know, once it's hit a particular level, they don't often publish the data on where it's gone after that. So that's something we're looking into. We're definitely doing some work again around what it will have, impact it will have in terms of workforce, and we're looking particularly at visas and you know, what sorts of visas would work for the voluntary sector. So that was probably quite a rambling answer, but hopefully it gives you a sense of the work we're doing around it.
Yeah. Let's see. I can talk a bit on that. Okay. Well, yeah. Pauline has asked, can we use the data to prove that small or micro charities are doing as good or better work locally than large charities?
So I think there's a question. It's a good question. It's a very good question. I think there's a couple of aspects to that. The first is the Almanac doesn't really tell us about the impact of that organisations are making. It's drawn primarily from accounts data. It's telling us something about the activities and their areas of activity. But if you are interested, I know that Lloyds Bank Foundation are doing a piece of research specifically around this. They have a very tight focus on the impact of small and medium-sized charities and the effects of various challenges and barriers facing them. So I would have a look at the work that they're doing around that if you want to think about really, how the added value that small locally based organisations that understand their users at a very granular level, that added value that they bring.
Yeah. So Marie's asked a question about time use and the total number of hours people are volunteering, and whether there's any research about that. So we do include some estimates in the Almanac as well, but something that's just recently come out that I think can be very useful here is some research done by the ONS, which is combining their time use survey with the community life survey data that we use in the Almanac, and it's basically mapping the hours in a day and how much time people are spending volunteering, when are the peak hours that people are volunteering. And it's interesting because you can compare that volunteering data to things like mass media consumption, and there's some really interesting charts that show the different balancing of time that people have, and a lot of subgroup analysis as well. So I definitely recommend looking at that piece of research, and that's something we can send a link around to in the follow-up email that you'll get from this, and I think that would be really useful.
let's have a look. What should we pick out?
So we've got a question here, another volunteering question regarding volunteering in later life. So something that's recently been published on the NCVO website is a blog by Matt Hill. This has recently left, but he was doing a project specifically looking at volunteering in later life. And the kind of key findings from that were that when you're looking at the kind of 65 to 75 age group, levels of volunteering are relatively similar to some of the younger age groups. But it's when you hit that 75 plus mark that things start to tail off. And the kind of key barriers that older people are citing here are just generally feeling too old to volunteer, and also health and illness reasons. But kind of furthermore to that is the kind of definition they have of volunteering that's in their mind. That it's quite a narrow definition, so it's probably disregarding some of the things that we might class as volunteering. So maybe helping some others, like learning to knit or things, other activities like that, which they would class as just helping out a friend, but in some of the surveys would be classed as volunteering. So I think that also brings the number down. So yeah, I definitely recommend reading that blog by Matt Hill that's on the NCVO website, which has some really interesting conclusions on that.
I've got a question from Lynn here on whether the Almanac data tells us how much government or other funding is passed from major or super major organisations to micro, small, medium organisations, and whether that's shifted in recent years as grant income from government has decreased. So there is some data in the sense that we count in expenditure and indeed in the income of charities income, say, from the sector to the sector. So these are typically trusts or foundations giving grants to other voluntary organisations, and when it's given in that form, then we've actually got quite good data. So you could look at the Almanac data and you could say, right, let's look at the expenditure of those largest organisations on giving grants to the voluntary sector, and then you could look at the income of those smaller organisations for income from the voluntary sector, and that would give you a bit of a picture from that. In terms of subcontracting, it's a little more complicated because that would be reported in a different way in the charity accounts, which means that it would sort of, in terms of larger organisations, it would probably be charitable expenditure.
I think so, yeah.
And then in the income, it would show up.
It'd be hard to trace it through.
Yeah. So in terms of the role of foundations and the way that they sort of give out grants, reasonably good data. In terms of contracts, it's a bit trickier.
Okay. I think that is all we've got time for, actually. So thank you very much for joining us in today's session. I hope you found it useful. As I say, if you have any queries, you can use that email address that I put in that first slide, and please fill out the survey that you'll get when you close. So thanks a lot.
Cheers. Thanks for coming.